Blake Morrison had always believed that time was just another currency he could control. Sitting in the sterile waiting room of Boston General Hospital, surrounded by the familiar smell of disinfectant and the distant hum of fluorescent lights, he realized how wrong he'd been. His fingers drummed against the leather armrest of his chair, a nervous habit he'd developed during board meetings, now surfacing in a place where his wealth meant nothing. The call had come 3 days earlier, just as he was reviewing quarterly reports for his resort chain. Dr. Harrison's voice had been measured, professional, but Blake had caught the undertone. "We need to discuss your test results in person, Mr. Morrison." Now watching a young couple across from him, the woman's hand protectively resting on her rounded belly, Blake felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. At 38, he'd built an empire of luxury retreats that stretched from the Hamptons to Martha's Vineyard. He could buy anything, go anywhere, have anyone, but he'd never wanted to leave a legacy beyond quarterly earnings and architectural landmarks. Until now. "Mr. Morrison," the nurse's voice cut through his thoughts. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes that had probably delivered countless pieces of life-changing news. "Dr. Harrison will see you now." The walk down the hallway felt longer than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing like a countdown. He passed family photos on the walls, smiling children, proud parents, grandparents holding newborns, generations of love captured in simple frames. Dr. Harrison's office was warm despite the medical equipment. The doctor, a man in his 50s with graying temples and steady hands, gestured for Blake to sit. On the desk between them lay a manila folder that seemed to hold more weight than any contract Blake had ever signed. "Blake, I'm going to be direct with you," Dr. Harrison began, his fingers interlaced. "The hormonal imbalance we detected is more serious than we initially thought. Without treatment, you're looking at potential infertility within the next 6 to 8 months. The words hit Blake like a physical blow. He'd faced hostile takeovers, economic downturns, the death of his parents. But this felt different. This was about something he couldn't buy, couldn't negotiate, couldn't control through sheer will and determination. "What are my options?" Blake's voice came out steadier than he felt. "We can start hormone therapy immediately, but there are no guarantees. The success rate varies, and even with treatment," Dr. Harrison's pause said everything. "If having children is something you've ever considered, Blake, now might be the time to explore those options." Blake stared out the window at the Boston skyline, his city, his empire, his carefully constructed world. But for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about board meetings or profit margins. He was thinking about legacy, about leaving something real behind, about Emma. Emma Catherine Wells had been his constant for over 20 years, the only person who'd known him before the money, before the success, before he'd learned to keep everyone at arm's length. She was the one person who still called him out when he was being impossible, who remembered his mother's birthday, who had stayed by his side through every triumph and loss. Walking out of the hospital into the crisp October air, Blake pulled out his phone. His finger hovered over Emma's contact. What he was about to ask would change everything between them. But maybe it was time for everything to change. Emma Catherine Wells almost didn't answer the phone. She was curled up in her favorite reading corner, a worn velvet armchair by the window of her Cambridge apartment, grading essays on Pride and Prejudice, when Blake's name lit up her screen. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the evening breeze, and the warm glow of her desk lamp created a cocoon of comfort she was reluctant to leave. But it was Blake, and Blake never called after 9 p.m. unless something was wrong. "Hey," she said softly, setting down her red pen. "Everything okay?" There was a pause, longer than usual. Blake Morrison was never at a loss for words. He could charm investors, negotiate million-dollar deals, and command boardrooms with effortless confidence. But right now, he sounded different. "Emma, I need to see you. Tonight, if possible." Her heart skipped. In 20 years of friendship, Blake had never sounded so vulnerable. She glanced at her reflection in the dark window, blonde hair escaping from its messy bun, oversized cardigan hanging off her shoulders, no makeup except for the faint remnants of mascara she'd applied that morning for her teaching job at Brookline Academy. "Of course, do you want to come here or I'll pick you up in 20 minutes. The line went dead before she could respond. Emma stared at her phone, a familiar flutter of anxiety beginning in her chest. She reached for the small pill bottle on her nightstand, her evening dose of medication that helped quiet the worried thoughts that often spiraled in moments like these. 20 minutes later, She heard the familiar purr of Blake's Aston Martin pulling up outside her brownstone. She grabbed her coat and purse, pausing at the mirror in her hallway. Her blue eyes looked tired, a result of staying up too late reading as usual. She wondered if Blake would notice. He was leaning against the car when she stepped outside, and her breath caught. Even in the dim streetlight, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. His dark eyes found hers immediately, and for a moment they just stood there. Two people who'd shared everything except the one thing that mattered most. "You look tired," she said, settling into the passenger seat. "So do you." His smile was soft but strained. "When's the last time you slept before midnight?" "When's the last time you slept at all?" she countered, watching his profile as he drove through the quiet streets of Cambridge. They knew each other too well. Every tells, every defense mechanism, every way they avoided talking about what really mattered. He drove to their spot, a 24-hour diner in Harvard Square that served terrible coffee and amazing apple pie. It was where they'd spent countless nights during college, where Blake had cried after his mother's funeral, where Emma had confessed her fears about never being brave enough to really live. The vinyl booth was as worn as ever, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on Blake's face as he sat across from her. Emma wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, using the warmth to steady herself. "I saw a doctor today," Blake began, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's stomach dropped. "Blake, what?" "I'm fine. I mean, I will be. But there's something I need to tell you, and I need you to just listen, okay?" She nodded, even though every instinct told her to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to demand answers immediately. Blake told her everything. The diagnosis, the timeline, the options that weren't really options. Emma listened without interrupting, watching the way his fingers traced patterns on the formica table, the way his voice cracked slightly when he talked about legacy and time running out. When he finished, the diner felt impossibly quiet despite the distant clatter of dishes and muffled conversations from other late-night souls seeking refuge. "What do you need from me?" Emma asked finally, because that's what she always asked. That's what she'd been asking for 20 years. Blake looked up then, and Emma saw something in his eyes that made her heart stop. Desperation, hope, fear. "I need you to have my baby." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they were brave enough to cross. Emma's coffee grew cold as the words echoed in her mind. "I need you to have my baby." The diner around them seemed to fade, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, even the harsh fluorescent lights dimmed to nothing. There was only Blake sitting across from her with his hands pressed flat against the table, waiting for her to say something. Anything, but Emma couldn't speak. 20 years of friendship, of knowing exactly what to say to comfort him, to challenge him, to make him laugh, and now she was speechless. "Emma?" Blake's voice was barely a whisper. "Please say something." She looked down at her hands, wrapped around the ceramic mug that had become her anchor. Her mind raced through 1,000 thoughts at once. This was Blake, her Blake, asking her to do something that would change everything between them, something that would require her to give him a part of herself she'd never given anyone. "Why me?" she finally managed, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. Blake was silent for a long moment, and when she looked up, she saw him struggling with words that seemed too big for the space between them. "Because you're the only person I trust with something this important," he said. "Because you know me, really know me, and you still choose to be here. Because," he paused, running a hand through his hair, "because I can't imagine bringing a child into this world with anyone else." Emma felt her chest tighten. She thought about her students at Brookline Academy, how she watched them navigate first loves and heartbreaks, how she guided them through the complexities of literature while never experiencing those depths herself. She thought about her small apartment, her quiet evenings, her careful, controlled life. "Blake, I've never—" She stopped, heat rising in her cheeks. Of course he knew. They'd talked about everything over the years, her choice to wait, to focus on her career, to avoid the complications that came with physical intimacy. But saying it now, in this context, felt different. "I know," he said gently, "and I would never ask you to do anything you're not comfortable with. We could go to a clinic, keep it medical, professional." The word professional hit her like a slap. Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Several late-night diners glanced their way, but she didn't care. She needed air, space, somewhere to think that wasn't under Blake's intense gaze. "Where are you going?" Blake called after her. but she was already pushing through the glass door into the cool October night. Cambridge streets were quieter at this hour, but Emma walked with purpose toward the Charles River. Her breath came out in small puffs, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. Behind her, she heard Blake's footsteps, but he didn't try to catch up. He knew her well enough to give her space when she needed it. At the riverbank, Emma stopped. The water reflected the city lights, creating ripples of gold and silver that danced with each passing breeze. She'd come here countless times during college, during the difficult years after her father's death, whenever life felt too overwhelming to handle. Blake's voice came from behind her, soft and uncertain. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "No," she said, turning to face him. "You should have. If anyone should ask me this, it's you." Relief flooded his expression, but Emma wasn't finished. But not like that. Not medical and professional. She took a step closer, her blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Blake, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to give you a child, it won't be in some sterile clinic with strangers in lab coats." Blake's breath caught. "Emma, if we do this," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "it has to mean something, it has to be real, because I can't—" Her voice broke slightly. "I can't give you something this important and pretend it doesn't matter to me." The space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken truths. Blake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the conflict in his dark eyes. Gratitude, fear, and something else she didn't dare name. "Are you saying yes?" he asked. Emma looked out over the water one more time, at the lights dancing on its surface, at the promise of something beautiful and terrifying. "I'm saying yes," she whispered, "but on my terms." And in that moment, both of them knew that nothing between them would ever be the same again. 3 days passed before Emma found the courage to call him. She'd spent those days in a haze of routine, teaching her literature classes, grading papers, attending faculty meetings, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she opened Pride and Prejudice to prepare her lessons, she thought about Elizabeth Bennet's courage to speak her mind, to demand respect, to refuse to settle for less than she deserved. Her students at Brookline Academy noticed her distraction. During Thursday's discussion of Mr. Darcy's first proposal, 16-year-old Melody Chen raised her hand. "Ms. Wells, do you think Elizabeth was stupid to reject him the first time? I mean, he was rich and everything." Emma paused, her hand tightening around her copy of the book. "What do you think, Melody? Is money enough to build a life on?" "But he loved her," another student chimed in. "Isn't that what matters?" "He thought he loved her," Emma corrected gently. "But love isn't just about wanting someone, it's about seeing them, understanding them, respecting them enough to meet them where they are." The words hung in the air long after the bell rang and her students filed out. Emma sat alone in her classroom, surrounded by posters of literary quotes and half-finished essays, realizing she'd been talking to herself as much as to them. That evening, she finally dialed Blake's number. "Em?" He answered on the first ring, his voice hopeful and nervous. "Friday night," she said without preamble. "Your place. We need to talk about how this is going to work." There was a pause. "Okay. Should I prepare anything? Make dinner?" Despite everything, Emma almost smiled. Blake Morrison, who could negotiate million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was nervous about making her dinner. "Just be yourself," she said softly. "That's all I've ever needed from you." Friday evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made Boston feel like it was holding its breath. Emma stood outside Blake's Beacon Hill townhouse, a converted 19th century building that somehow managed to be both impressive and understated, much like Blake himself. She'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple navy dress that made her feel confident without trying too hard. Her hands shook slightly as she rang the doorbell, and she took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of autumn leaves and the distant hint of the harbor. Blake opened the door wearing dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, more casual than she'd seen him in years. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made her heart skip. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, you always are, but tonight—" "Blake." She stepped inside, her voice gentle. "We need to talk about boundaries." His living room was exactly as she remembered. Comfortable leather furniture, built-in bookshelves, a fireplace that cast warm shadows on the hardwood floors. But tonight, everything felt different, charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. They sat on his couch, careful to maintain distance, and Emma felt like a teenager again. Nervous, excited, terrified of saying the wrong thing. I've been thinking, she began, her hands folded in her lap, about what this means. What we're really doing here. Blake nodded, leaning forward slightly. And, if we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were. You understand that, right? I know, he said quietly. I've been thinking about that too. Emma studied his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that he was having second thoughts. Instead, she saw the same steady determination that had carried him through every challenge they'd faced together. I need you to understand something, she continued, her voice growing stronger. This isn't just about biology for me. It can't be. If I'm going to give you this part of myself, I need to know that you see me, really see me, not just as a means to an end. Blake was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Emma, I've been seeing you for 20 years. Maybe that's the problem. I've been looking at you so long I forgot to tell you what I was seeing. The words hit her like a physical touch, and she felt something shift between them. A door opening that had been closed for far too long. What do you see? She whispered. Blake reached across the space between them, his fingers barely grazing hers. I see the woman who stayed up all night with me when my mother died. I see the person who believes in happy endings even when life tries to prove her wrong. I see someone who deserves to be loved the way she loves others, completely without reservation. Emma's breath caught. Blake, I see you, Emma. I've always seen you. And in that moment, she knew they weren't just talking about having a baby anymore. The silence that followed Blake's words stretched between them like a held breath. Emma stared at their hands, his fingers still barely touching hers, and felt the weight of 20 years of careful boundaries suddenly shift. The fire crackled softly in the background, casting dancing shadows across Blake's face, and she realized she was memorizing this moment. The way the light caught the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the slight tremor in his voice when he'd said her name, the way her heart was beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. Blake, she whispered, but the words she needed seemed to scatter like leaves in the wind. He must have sensed her struggle because he shifted closer, his thumb tracing the lightest circle across her knuckles. It was such a simple touch, but it sent electricity shooting up her arm, making her aware of every nerve ending in her body. We don't have to decide anything tonight, he said softly. We can take this as slow as you need. Emma looked up at him then, really looked at him, and saw something that made her chest tighten. This wasn't the confident businessman who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals. This was Blake at 17, shy and uncertain, asking her to prom with a bouquet of daisies he'd picked from his mother's garden. This was Blake at 25, holding her while she cried over her father's diagnosis. This was Blake stripped of all his armor, vulnerable and waiting for her to decide their fate. I'm scared, she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Of me? Of losing you. Her voice broke slightly. Blake, you're the most important person in my life. You always have been. And once we cross this line, hey, he moved even closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. Look at me. She did, drowning in the warmth of his gaze. You're not going to lose me. Whatever happens, however this plays out, you will never lose me. I promise you that. The sincerity in his voice made her eyes fill with tears she hadn't expected. How long had she been holding her breath, waiting for someone to promise her forever? How long had she been afraid to want something this much? I need you to promise me something else, she said, her voice steadier now. Anything. If we do this, when we do this, I need it to be real. Not just the physical part, but all of it. I need you to be present with me, not thinking about outcomes or timelines or medical necessities, just us. Can you do that? Blake's answer came not in words, but in the way he leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. They breathed the same air, shared the same space, and Emma felt something inside her chest unlock, a door she'd kept carefully guarded for 31 years. I've wanted to kiss you since we were 19, he confessed, so quietly she almost missed it. Emma's heart stopped. Why didn't you? Because I was afraid I wasn't good enough for you. Because I thought you deserved someone who could give you poetry and grand gestures and all those things you read about in your books. A laugh escaped her, soft and watery and full of wonder. Blake Morrison, you brought me first edition novels for my birthday. You stayed with me through 3 different anxiety attacks. You know my coffee order and my favorite hiding spots and the exact way I like my eggs. You've been giving me poetry for 20 years. Something shifted in his expression then. Surprise giving way to hope. Hope blooming into something deeper and more certain. Emma, he breathed, and this time when he said her name, It sounded like a prayer. She closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that was soft and tentative and perfect. It lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. When they broke apart, Emma saw her own amazement reflected in Blake's eyes. "Wow," she whispered. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice rough. "Wow." They stayed like that, foreheads touching, sharing the same space and the same breath, while the fire died down to glowing embers around them. Emma felt a calmness settle over her that she hadn't experienced in years, the peace that came from finally admitting what her heart had known all along. "Stay tonight," Blake said eventually, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Nothing has to happen. Just stay." Emma thought about her empty apartment, her cold bed, her careful, controlled life. Then she looked at Blake, really looked at him, and saw her future staring back at her. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." And as he led her upstairs, their fingers intertwined, Emma realized she wasn't just staying the night. She was finally coming home. Emma woke to the sound of rain against unfamiliar windows. For a moment, she was disoriented. The sheets smelled different, cedar and something uniquely Blake, and the morning light filtered through curtains she didn't recognize. Then memory flooded back, and her cheeks warmed as she remembered the night before. They had made love with a tenderness that surprised them both. What started as nervous touches and whispered reassurances had become something deeper, more profound than either had imagined. Blake had been patient beyond measure, guiding her through every moment with gentle hands and soft words. And Emma had discovered that intimacy with someone who truly saw her was nothing like the clinical transaction she'd feared. Now, wrapped in Blake's arms with her head on his chest, she listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and wondered if this was what home was supposed to feel like. "You're thinking too loud," Blake murmured against her hair, his voice thick with sleep. Emma tilted her head to look at him. His dark hair was tousled, and there was something boyish about the way he smiled at her in the morning light. "Sorry, I'm not used to this." "Regrets?" The question came out carefully neutral, but Emma caught the underlying worry. "No," she said immediately, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. "No regrets. Just processing." Blake's arms tightened around her slightly. "We crossed a line last night." "Several lines," Emma agreed, then blushed at her own boldness. They lay in comfortable silence, watching the rain streak down the bedroom windows. Emma traced patterns on Blake's chest, marveling at this new intimacy, this permission to touch him without pretense or careful boundaries. "Blake," she said eventually. What happens now?" It was the question they'd both been avoiding, but it hung in the air between them like a third presence. What happened when the biology worked or didn't? What happened to this newfound closeness when the practical reasons for their arrangement were resolved? Blake was quiet for so long that Emma began to worry she'd ruined the perfect morning with her need for certainty. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than evasive. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life planning 5 moves ahead, but with you, I just want to see where this goes." Emma pushed herself up on her elbow to study his face. "That doesn't sound very Blake Morrison of you. Maybe that's a good thing." His hand came up to tuck a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Maybe I've been so busy planning the future that I've been missing the present." The gesture was so tender, so unconsciously intimate, that Emma felt her heart squeeze. This was dangerous territory, falling for Blake while pretending this was just about having a baby. But looking at him now, soft and unguarded in the morning light, she wondered if maybe they'd both been pretending for longer than they cared to admit. "I should probably go home," she said, though every part of her wanted to stay wrapped in this moment forever. "Should you?" Blake's thumb traced her jawline. "It's Saturday. No classes to teach, no board meetings to attend. We could just be." The word hung between them, full of possibility. When was the last time Emma had just been? Without schedules or obligations or the constant pressure to be responsible, controlled, perfect. "I don't have any clothes," she said weakly. "You can borrow something of mine." Blake's smile was soft and encouraging. "Stay, Em. Let me make you breakfast. Let me take care of you for once." And maybe it was the way he said her name, or maybe it was the way his eyes held hers with such quiet intensity, but Emma found herself nodding before she could overthink it. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." Blake's smile could have powered the entire city. An hour later, Emma found herself in Blake's kitchen, wearing one of his MIT sweatshirts that hung to her knees and a pair of his boxer shorts that she had to roll at the waist. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun and she had no makeup on, But when Blake looked at her, she felt beautiful. "Pancakes or French toast?" he asked, already pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. "You don't have to," Emma began, but Blake cut her off with a look. Let me do this." So she did. She sat at his kitchen island, sipping coffee from his favorite mug, and watched Blake Morrison, millionaire businessman, master of the universe, make her pancakes from scratch. He hummed while he cooked, occasionally stealing glances at her that made her stomach flutter, and Emma realized this was a side of him she'd never seen before. "You're staring," he said without turning around. "You're humming," she countered. "I didn't know you hummed." "I don't. Usually." He flipped a pancake with practiced ease. "Apparently, you bring out hidden talents in me." The words were light, teasing, but they carried an undercurrent of truth that made Emma's chest tighten. How many parts of themselves had they hidden from each other over the years? How many moments like this had they missed because they were too afraid to risk what they already had? "Blake," she said softly. "Yeah? Whatever happens. With the baby. With us. I want you to know that last night meant something to me. It wasn't just about the arrangement." Blake turned then, spatula in hand, and the look in his eyes made Emma's breath catch. "It meant something to me too," he said quietly. "More than I expected. More than I probably should have let it." And as they looked at each other across his sun-drenched kitchen, Emma realized they weren't just talking about making a baby anymore. They were talking about making a life. 2 weeks later, Emma knew something had changed, and not in the way she'd hoped. Blake had become polite, considerate, perfectly, devastatingly distant. He still called every day, but the conversations were careful, measured. He asked about her classes, her health, whether she needed anything. He sent her flowers, beautiful arrangements that arrived at Brookline Academy with cards signed simply B. But when she tried to talk about what had happened between them that night, that perfect morning in his kitchen, he deflected with the skill of someone who'd spent years mastering the art of emotional evasion. Emma stared at the latest bouquet, white roses and baby's breath, sitting on her desk during her lunch break. The irony wasn't lost on her. Baby's breath. She wondered if Blake had chosen them deliberately or if the florist had a cruel sense of humor. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. "Hope you're having a good day. Taking you to dinner tonight? 7 p.m. Even his texts had become formal. Emma typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on a simple, "Sure. My place or yours? I'll pick you up." She stared at the screen, waiting for something more. A heart emoji, a joke, anything that resembled the easy intimacy they'd shared before. But nothing came. That evening, Blake arrived precisely at 7, looking impeccable in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent. He held the passenger door of his car open for her, waited until she was settled before closing it with careful precision. The gesture felt more like obligation than affection. "You look beautiful," he said as they drove through downtown Boston, but even the compliment felt rehearsed. "Thank you," Emma replied, smoothing her navy dress, the same one she'd worn to his house that first night. She'd chosen it, hoping to remind him of how things had been between them, but Blake's eyes barely lingered on her. He took her to Mistral, an upscale restaurant in the South End, where the lighting was soft and the tables spaced far enough apart for private conversation. It was the kind of place where Blake conducted business dinners, and Emma felt the formality of it like a wall between them. "How are you feeling?" he asked once they'd ordered, his tone concerned but clinical. "Any symptoms?" Emma's stomach clenched. There it was, the real reason for dinner, not because he wanted to see her, not because he missed her, but because he was checking on his investment. "Nothing yet," she said quietly, stabbing at her salad. "It's still early." "Of course, doctor. Harrison said it could take several cycles." Blake cut his steak with surgical precision. "We should probably schedule another appointment soon, to make sure everything is on track." The word "we" should have warmed her, but it felt cold, transactional. Emma set down her fork, her appetite gone. "Blake, what are we doing here? Having dinner?" His attempt at lightness fell flat. "No, I mean, what are we doing? This?" She gestured between them. "Whatever this has become." "You've barely looked at me all evening." Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm being respectful, giving you space." "I didn't ask for space." Emma's voice was sharper than she intended, earning a glance from the couple at the neighboring table. She lowered it to a whisper. "I asked for honesty. I asked for you to be present with me. I am present." "No, you're not. You're here, but you're not present." Not the way you were that night. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pressed on. Talk to me, Blake, really talk to me. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped, and Emma saw something raw in his expression. Fear, maybe, or regret. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. What do you want me to say, Em? I want you to tell me what changed. I want you to tell me why you're treating me like a stranger when 2 weeks ago you... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence in public. Blake leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Because I can't afford to confuse this, Emma. What happened between us? It was beautiful, but it can't happen again. Not if we want this arrangement to work. The word, arrangement, hit her like a physical blow. Emma felt something inside her chest shatter. Not her heart exactly, but the hope she'd been carefully nurturing since that perfect morning in his kitchen. Arrangement, she repeated flatly. You know what I mean. No, I don't think I do. Emma stood abruptly, her napkin falling to the floor. Excuse me. She made it to the restaurant's bathroom before the tears came. Locked in a stall, she pressed her back against the door and let herself fall apart quietly. She'd been so foolish, thinking that one night of tenderness meant something more than biology, thinking that Blake Morrison, who'd spent his entire adult life keeping people at arm's length, would suddenly change for her. Her phone buzzed with a text. Em, please come back. Let me explain. She stared at the message until the words blurred, then deleted it without responding. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, she found Blake waiting by the hostess stand, his expression stricken. Don't, she said before he could speak. Just don't. Emma, please. Take me home, Blake. And next time you want to check on your investment, just call. The ride back to her apartment was silent except for the sound of rain beginning to fall against the windshield. Emma stared out the passenger window, watching the city blur past, and wondered if this was how it felt to have your heart broken by someone who didn't even realize he was holding it. When they reached her building, Blake finally spoke. Em, I need you to understand. No, she said, not looking at him. I understand perfectly. Thank you for dinner. She was out of the car before he could respond, walking through the rain toward her front door without looking back. Behind her, she heard Blake call her name, but she didn't stop. Some distances, she was learning, couldn't be crossed twice. Emma stared at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands, the single line stark and definitive. Negative. She'd known it was too early, barely 3 weeks since that night, but hope had made her reckless. Hope and the desperate need to know if the hollow ache in her chest was worth something, anything at all. Her bathroom suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in as she sank onto the edge of her bathtub. Outside her Cambridge apartment, the October morning was crisp and bright, but Emma felt like she was drowning in shadows. Her phone had been silent for 4 days now. 4 days since the disaster at Mistral, since she'd walked away from Blake in the rain. 4 days of checking her messages obsessively, typing texts she never sent, and pretending she wasn't falling apart. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was grieving the absence of a pregnancy she wasn't even sure she'd wanted, from a man who'd made it clear she was nothing more than a convenient solution to his problem. A knock at her door startled her from her spiral of self-pity. Emma glanced at the clock. 8:30 a.m. on a Saturday. Too early for visitors. Too late to pretend she wasn't home. Emma? Blake's voice came through the door, muffled but unmistakable. I know you're in there. Your car is outside. Emma's heart clenched. Of course he'd noticed her car. Blake noticed everything, except, apparently, that he'd shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces. Go away, Blake, she called, not moving from her perch on the bathtub edge. We need to talk. No, we don't. Emma, please. I've been calling. I know. She finally stood, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. I've been ignoring you. There was a pause, and when Blake spoke again, his voice was softer. Just 5 minutes, please. Against her better judgment, Emma found herself walking to the door. She unlocked it but didn't open it, instead leaning her forehead against the cool wood. What do you want, Blake? To apologize. To explain. Another pause. To see your face. The last words were spoken so quietly, she almost missed them. Emma closed her eyes, warring with herself. She could send him away, protect what was left of her dignity, maintain the distance he'd so carefully constructed between them, or she could open the door and let him destroy her all over again. She opened the door. Blake stood in her hallway looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his white button-down was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too much coffee and too little rest. In his hands, he held a first-edition copy of Jane Eyre, her favorite novel, one she'd mentioned loving but never owning. "You look terrible," Emma said, stepping aside to let him in. "So do you," he replied, but his voice was gentle. "When's the last time you ate something?" Emma shrugged, closing the door behind him. "I've been busy. Busy avoiding me. Busy protecting myself." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw Blake flinch. He set the book on her coffee table and turned to face her fully. "Emma, about the other night, which part? The part where you treated me like a business associate? Or the part where you called what happened between us an arrangement?" Blake's jaw tightened. "I was trying to be professional." "Why?" Emma's voice cracked slightly. "Why did you need to be professional with me, Blake? After everything we've shared, after 20 years of friendship, after that night when you—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Because I was scared," Blake said quietly. Emma blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. "Scared of what?" "Of wanting you." The admission came out raw, unfiltered. "Of wanting you so much that I'd forget why we started this in the first place. Of ruining the best thing in my life because I couldn't keep my feelings separate from the arrangement." Emma stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your feelings?" Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd seen him make 1,000 times when he was struggling with something difficult. "Emma, I've been in love with you for 20 years, maybe longer, and when we were together that night, when I felt you, I knew I was in trouble." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. 20 years. He'd loved her for 20 years and never said a word. "You're in love with me," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Completely, hopelessly, in the kind of love that makes you do stupid things like ask your best friend to have your baby because you can't imagine having a child with anyone else." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Then why did you push me away?" "Because you deserve better than a man who tricks you into bed under the pretense of making a baby." Blake's voice was thick with self-recrimination. "You deserved honesty from the beginning and I didn't give it to you." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Blake, do you want to know what I was thinking that night when we were together?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "I was thinking that I'd been waiting my whole life to feel that connected to another person. I was thinking that I'd rather give you my heart than just my body. I was thinking—" She took a shaky breath. "I was thinking that I love you too, that I've probably loved you since we were teenagers, but I was too scared to ruin what we had." Blake's eyes widened. "Emma, I took a test this morning," she said quietly. It was negative. Blake's face fell, and Emma saw the disappointment he tried to hide. But there was something else there too, relief, maybe, or hope. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know how much you wanted—" "No," Emma interrupted, "you don't understand. I wasn't disappointed because I'm not pregnant, Blake. I was disappointed because it meant I had one less reason to keep you in my life." Blake crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling Emma into his arms with a desperation that made her breath catch. "You don't need a reason," he whispered against her hair. "You never needed a reason. You're the reason for everything else." And as Emma melted into his embrace, she realized that maybe some tests were meant to fail, to clear the way for something better, something real, something that had been waiting 20 years to begin. 3 weeks later, Emma found herself standing in front of Martha's Vineyard Real Estate, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Blake stood beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers, pointing at a small cottage in the window display. It was nothing like his sophisticated Beacon Hill townhouse. This was weathered shingles and climbing roses, window boxes overflowing with autumn flowers, and a front porch that begged for lazy Sunday mornings. "It's perfect," Emma breathed. And she meant it. They'd spent the last 3 weeks rediscovering each other, not as childhood friends or business partners in an arrangement, but as 2 people finally brave enough to be vulnerable. Blake had shown up at her apartment every day after work, sometimes with dinner, sometimes with nothing but the desire to sit beside her while she graded papers. They'd talked until dawn about dreams they'd never shared, fears they'd hidden, and the 20 years of almost moments they'd both been too scared to pursue. And then, 2 nights ago, Blake had asked her a question that changed everything. "Marry me, Em. Not because of babies or timelines or any practical reason. Marry me because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life." He'd been sitting on her couch at the time. No ring, no grand gesture, just Blake in his stocking feet asking her to be his wife with the same quiet certainty he'd shown when he asked her to have his child. But this time, Emma had said yes without hesitation. "The owner is asking $350," the real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Dorothy, was saying as she unlocked the cottage door. "But it needs work. New roof, updated plumbing, kitchen renovation. We'll take it," Blake said before they'd even stepped inside. Dorothy blinked. "Don't you want to see the interior first? Check the foundation? Get an inspection?" Emma squeezed Blake's hand. "He's impulsive when he's happy," she explained, earning a soft laugh from the man beside her. But as they walked through the cottage, past the stone fireplace that would be perfect for winter evenings, through the sun-drenched kitchen where Blake could make his famous pancakes, up the narrow stairs to a bedroom with windows that overlooked the harbor, Emma understood his certainty. This wasn't just a house. It was a promise, a future, a place where they could build something that belonged entirely to them. "The master bedroom has water views," Dorothy pointed out, opening the French doors to a small balcony. "And there's a finished attic that would make a perfect nursery someday." Emma felt her cheeks warm, but Blake's arm tightened around her waist in a gesture of pure contentment. "Someday," he agreed softly, and Emma heard the patience in his voice. No pressure, no timelines, just possibility stretching out before them like an endless summer. Later, sitting on the cottage's front steps with paperwork scattered between them and Dorothy's business card tucked safely in Blake's wallet, Emma marveled at how simple it had been. One signature, one check, one leap of faith, and they owned a piece of forever. "My students are going to think I've lost my mind," Emma said, leaning against Blake's shoulder. "Quitting my job, moving to an island, marrying my best friend. Are you having second thoughts?" Blake's voice was light, but Emma caught the underlying worry. "About marrying you?" "Never." She turned to face him fully. "About the rest of it. Blake, I've spent my whole life playing it safe, choosing the secure job, the practical apartment, the careful path. But with you, I want to be brave." Blake's smile was soft and wondering. "You've always been brave, Em. You just forgot for a while." As if to prove his point, Emma leaned over and kissed him, right there on the front porch of their new home, with the autumn sun warming their faces and the sound of harbor waves in the distance. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of lazy Sunday mornings and shared secrets and the particular intimacy of two people who'd chosen each other again and again. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," he whispered back. "I love you, and I love this house, and I love the life we're going to build here." Emma thought about the girl she'd been at 18, shy, bookish, convinced that love was something that happened to other people. She thought about the woman she'd become at 31, careful, controlled, afraid to want too much. And she thought about who she was becoming now, brave enough to love without guarantees, strong enough to trust in forever. "Blake?" she said, settling more comfortably against his side. "Yeah, when we have babies, and we will have babies, I want them to grow up here. I want them to know that love can be patient enough to wait 20 years and brave enough to risk everything." Blake was quiet for a moment, and when Emma looked up at him, she saw tears in his eyes. "I want that too," he said quietly. "I want all of it. With you." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon stretched toward evening, watching boats bob in the harbor and planning a life that felt both inevitable and miraculous. Emma thought about all the books she'd read, all the love stories that had seemed too good to be true, and realized that the best ones weren't about perfect people finding perfect love. They were about imperfect people finding their perfect match. They were about coming home to someone who'd been waiting for you all along. "Mrs. Morrison," Blake said, suddenly testing the name. Emma's heart fluttered. "Mrs. Emma Catherine Morrison. It has a nice ring to it." "Yeah," Emma agreed, watching the sunset paint the harbor gold and pink and perfect. "It really does." And as they sat on the porch of their future, Emma realized that some of the best love stories didn't begin with falling. They began with finally standing still long enough to see what had been there all along. 6 months later, Emma stood in front of an antique mirror in the cottage's master bedroom, smoothing the delicate lace of her grandmother's wedding dress. It wasn't the dress she'd imagined wearing as a little girl. That had been a princess gown with endless layers of tulle and a train that could fill a cathedral. This was simpler, more elegant, with tiny pearl buttons down the back and sleeves that fell just to her wrists. It was a dress that whispered rather than shouted, and it was perfect for a woman who'd learned that the most profound love often came in quiet moments. Through the French doors, she could see the garden where they'd spent the winter months planning their wedding. Blake had insisted on doing most of the work himself, planting roses, building an arbor where they'd exchange vows, creating a space that would be theirs alone. Emma had watched him from the kitchen window on countless Saturday mornings, sleeves rolled up, dirt under his fingernails, humming the same tune he'd hummed while making her pancakes that first morning together. Now, in the golden light of an April afternoon, their garden was coming to life. Daffodils nodded in the ocean breeze, cherry blossoms drifted like snow across the lawn, and the arbor Blake had built was woven with climbing roses that wouldn't bloom until summer, but they'd planted them anyway, an act of faith in their future. "You're stunning," said Blake's sister Caroline, adjusting Emma's veil with gentle hands. Caroline had flown in from Seattle the night before, armed with family photos and stories Emma had never heard. "My brother is the luckiest man alive." Emma smiled, thinking of Blake downstairs, probably pacing the living room in his navy suit while their officiant, a gentle minister from the island's historic church, tried to calm his nerves. They'd chosen to keep the ceremony small. Caroline, Blake's business partner David, and Emma's colleague and closest friend from Brookline Academy, Margaret. Intimate felt right for two people who'd spent 20 years learning each other's hearts. "Are you nervous?" Caroline asked, securing the last bobby pin in Emma's upswept hair. "No," Emma said, and realized she meant it. She'd been nervous before her first kiss, nervous before their first night together, nervous about 1,000 small moments along the way. But this, marrying Blake, promising him forever, felt as natural as breathing. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and Margaret appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's time," she said softly. "And Em? He looks like he's about to burst from happiness." Emma took one last look in the mirror, seeing not the careful, controlled woman she'd been for so long, but someone new, someone brave enough to trust in love, strong enough to build a life on the foundation of friendship, wise enough to know that the best things in life were worth waiting for. The cottage's narrow staircase creaked as she descended, her hand trailing along the banister Blake had lovingly restored. She could hear the gentle murmur of voices from the garden, the distant sound of waves against the shore, the rustle of her dress against the wooden steps, and then she stepped through the French doors into their garden, and the world fell away. Blake stood beneath the rose arbor, his dark hair catching the afternoon light, his hands clasped behind his back in the way he always stood when he was trying to contain his emotions. But when he saw her, his careful composure cracked, and Emma saw wonder bloom across his face like sunrise. She walked toward him slowly, drinking in this moment, the way Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, the way Caroline beamed with pride, the way David cleared his throat roughly and looked away. But mostly she focused on Blake, on the way his eyes never left hers, on the slow smile that spread across his face as she approached. "Hi," she whispered when she reached him, the word barely audible over the sound of her racing heart. "Hi," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "You're beautiful. So are you." The minister began to speak, words about love and commitment, about choosing each other every day, about the sacred promise they were making. But Emma heard it all through a haze of happiness, focused instead on Blake's hands holding hers, on the way his thumb traced circles on her palm, on the certainty in his eyes that said he'd waited his whole life for this moment. When it came time for vows, Blake spoke first, his voice steady despite the tears he didn't try to hide. "Emma, you've been my constant for 20 years, my safe harbor, my voice of reason, my reminder that there's goodness in the world. You've seen me at my worst and somehow decided I was worth loving anyway. Today I'm not just promising to be your husband, I'm promising to be worthy of the gift you've given me, your heart, your trust, your faith in our future. I promise to love you through every season, to choose you every day, and to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how cherished you are." Emma's tears fell freely as she spoke her own vows, words she'd written and rewritten a dozen times before realizing that the truest ones came straight from her heart. "Blake, you've been my home since before I knew what home meant. You've taught me that love isn't about perfection, it's about showing up, about being present, about choosing to see the best in each other, even when it's hard. You've waited for me to be brave enough to love you the way you deserved, and somehow you never stopped believing I'd get there. Today, I'm not just promising to be your wife. I'm promising to be your partner in every adventure, your soft place to land after every challenge, and your reminder that you are loved beyond measure." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Blake kissed her, Emma tasted salt and sunshine and the promise of forever. Their small gathering erupted in cheers, but Emma barely heard them over the sound of her own heart singing. Later, as the sun set over Martha's Vineyard, and their friends had departed for the evening, Emma and Blake sat on their front porch steps, still in their wedding clothes, sharing a bottle of champagne and watching the stars appear one by one. "Mrs. Morrison," Blake said, the name still sounding new and wonderful on his lips. "Mr. Morrison," Emma replied, snuggling closer to his side. "Any regrets?" Emma thought about the question seriously, as she always did when Blake asked it. She thought about the life she'd left behind in Cambridge, the careful plans she'd abandoned, the woman she'd been before she learned to be brave. "Only one," she said finally. Blake's body tensed slightly. "What's that?" Emma smiled, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "That we waited so long to get here." Blake's laughter was warm and rich and full of joy. "Well, Mrs. Morrison, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." As if summoned by his words, Emma felt a familiar flutter in her stomach, one she'd been feeling for the past week but hadn't dared to hope meant what she thought it might mean. Tomorrow, she would take a test. Tomorrow, she would find out if their family was already beginning to grow. But tonight, she simply held her husband's hand and watched the stars reflect on the harbor, content in the knowledge that some love stories don't begin with a first kiss or a wedding day. They begin the moment two hearts recognize they've found their home in each other. And this love story, theirs, was just beginning. Emma Morrison stood at the kitchen window of their Martha's Vineyard cottage, watching her husband chase their 18-month-old daughter through the garden where they'd been married. Little Grace Catherine Morrison, named for Blake's mother and Emma's middle name, had inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's curious blue eyes, along with a determination that suggested she'd be keeping them both on their toes for years to come. At the moment, she was toddling between the rose bushes with the focused concentration of someone on a very important mission, while Blake followed close behind, ready to catch her if she stumbled. "Dada!" Grace squealed as she spotted a butterfly landing on one of the climbing roses. She pointed with chubby fingers, her face alight with wonder at the simple magic of a spring morning. "I see it, sweetheart," Blake said, scooping her up so she could get a closer look. "What color is it?" "Boo!" Grace announced confidently, even though the butterfly was clearly orange and black. "That's right, Blue," Blake agreed with the seriousness of someone discussing international finance rather than toddler color identification. Emma smiled, her hand unconsciously resting on the gentle curve of her belly where their second child was growing, a little boy who would arrive just before Grace's second birthday. They'd found out 3 weeks ago, and Blake had cried when she'd shown him the ultrasound picture. This strong man reduced to tears by the grainy image of his son. The pregnancy test that had been negative all those years ago felt like it belonged to a different lifetime, to a different woman who'd been too afraid to trust in love. This pregnancy had been different from the start, unplanned but deeply wanted, a natural extension of the life they'd built together, rather than the culmination of a desperate arrangement. "Mama!" Grace had spotted her in the window, and was waving with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't seen her mother in hours rather than minutes. Emma waved back, then made her way outside to join her family. The April morning was perfect, warm enough for Grace to play in just her pink overalls and tiny sneakers, but cool enough that Emma could wear her favorite sweater, one of Blake's old MIT sweatshirts that had become hers by right of marriage and countless stolen mornings. "How are my two favorite people?" she asked, wrapping her arms around Blake's waist from behind and resting her cheek against his back. "3," Blake corrected softly, his free hand covering hers on her stomach. "3 favorite people." Grace, meanwhile, had moved on from the butterfly to a more pressing concern. "Cookie?" she asked hopefully, having recently learned that this particular word had impressive powers. "After lunch," Emma said, taking her daughter into her arms. "But maybe we can have some strawberries from our garden." "Bee-wees!" Grace clapped her hands in delight. They'd planted the strawberry patch last spring when Grace was barely walking and Emma was still amazed by the simple miracle of being a mother. Now, watching her daughter's excitement over the prospect of fruit they'd grown themselves, Emma marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed exactly the same. Blake still hummed while he cooked breakfast on weekend mornings. Emma still graded papers curled up in her reading chair, though now she often had a small assistant who liked to help by adding colorful scribbles to the margins. They still took long walks on the beach in the evenings, though now they pushed a stroller and collected shells for a little girl who thought every smooth stone was a treasure. "I got a call from Dr. Harrison yesterday," Blake said as they settled on their front porch. Grace contentedly munching strawberries from her little bowl. Emma looked up from where she was braiding dandelions into a crown for Grace. Everything okay? More than okay. Blake's smile was soft and wondering. The hormone therapy worked better than anyone expected. He said we shouldn't have any trouble having as many children as we want. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming gratitude that still caught her off guard. How close they'd come to missing all of this. The lazy Sunday mornings, the tiny handprints on the windows, the particular chaos that came with loving someone small and fearless, and utterly dependent on you. How many do we want? She asked, settling Grace on her lap to crown her with dandelions. Blake considered this seriously, watching their daughter's face light up as she caught sight of herself in the window's reflection, crowned like the little queen she clearly believed herself to be. I used to think I wanted one, he said finally. A legacy, something to leave behind. But now, he gestured to their garden, their home, their daughter, who was now singing a wordless song to her reflection. Now, I think I want a houseful. I want Christmas mornings that require a bigger tree and summer vacations that require a bigger car and dinner tables that never have an empty chair. Emma leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of salt air and blooming roses and the particular sweetness that clung to toddlers who'd been playing in the sun. A houseful sounds perfect, she agreed. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, they moved inside for Grace's nap, settling her in the nursery that Blake had painted with clouds and stars and tiny boats sailing across pale blue walls. Emma read Goodnight Moon twice while Blake hummed softly, and when their daughter finally succumbed to sleep, they tiptoed out like the practiced parents they'd become. Later, as they sat together on their couch, Blake reading architectural journals while Emma worked on lesson plans for the island's small elementary school where she now taught. Emma thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, careful, controlled, convinced that love was something that happened to other people. She thought about that first night when Blake had asked her to have his baby, how terrified she'd been of crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. She thought about the test that had come back negative, how devastating it had felt at the time, and how necessary it had been for clearing the way to something better. Blake? She said softly. He looked up from his magazine. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? If the first test had been positive, if we'd gone through with the original arrangement? Blake set down his magazine and pulled her closer, his hand settling on her stomach where their son was growing. Sometimes, he admitted, but I think we would have ended up here anyway. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe we would have fought it more, but he pressed a kiss to her temple. I think we were always heading toward this, Em. Toward each other. Toward this life. Emma smiled, thinking of all the books she'd read about destiny and fate and love that conquered all. She'd always been skeptical of such things, too practical to believe in grand romantic gestures and soulmates. But sitting here in their home with their daughter sleeping upstairs and their son growing beneath her heart, with Blake's arms around her and 25 years of friendship behind them, Emma realized that the best love stories weren't about destiny. They were about choice, about choosing each other every day in big moments and small ones, through joy and challenge, and the ordinary miracle of building a life together. They were about learning that home wasn't a place you found. It was something you created one day at a time, with someone who saw you and chose to stay. And as the sun set over Martha's vineyard, painting their cottage in shades of gold and rose, Emma Morrison knew that she was exactly where she belonged, not because fate had decreed it, but because she'd been brave enough to choose love. And love, it turned out, had chosen her right back. What would you have done in Emma's place? Would you have been brave enough to risk everything for love? Have you ever found yourself falling for someone who was right there all along? Someone you'd known for years but never seen in that way? Share your thoughts about second chances and the courage it takes to rewrite your story, because sometimes the best love stories begin not with strangers meeting, but with friends finally seeing each other clearly. Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.